We can close one door.
This has been tested?
Yeah. Yeah, you can. Yeah.
I will let in the participants.
Yeah. Get some people who want to sit this side. You prefer them to be. Guys, if you want to come a little bit on the table, it'll be better. You have a.
I think people trickle in by 5-10 minutes.
Fair enough. I think there are a couple of people known who might be. Actually, when I came last time, I was sitting right there. It was थोड़ा सा एक दो खाली था. बाद में आया. Because I felt there was some yes, protocols in place. Only people from the organization.
There's a mic here, sir. Okay, I'll try. That's throat as well. Akash, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Those who joined physically and also those who have joined us virtually through the call. We have gathered here to discuss this book, which has been authored by Deepanshu and Abhinav, who are here with us today. They will present the ideas in the book, the arguments they will explain to you. Then my friend Siddharth and Dr. Ambreen, Agha will engage with the book critically. They will comment on the arguments in the book. They will be discussing it. The book is about a very important topic, populism, perhaps the most important political phenomenon of our times. And as it usually happens, academics, scholars have risen to the occasion of trying to understand it. A lot of work has happened on this. Political theorists as well as political scientists have been writing and working on this. Pretty much most of the major theorists and political scientists have something to say on this phenomenon, what it is, what leads to this phenomenon, where it should be applied, who is a populist and who is not. Often it's used as a pejorative, sometimes it's used as a descriptive analytical category. But this is not the first time that populism has become very prominent in democracies. Democracies contain within them the potential for rise as well as fall of populism. So democracy and populism are tied in very interesting ways. I remember reading in Democracy in America by Tocqueville many years ago, and he had identified populism. He meant something very different from that as one of the main values that makes American democracy work well. But there were 4 other values also he identified, which go together. It was a kind of a mix that works. But he meant it by populism, popular sovereignty. It was a very simple meaning. So one thing that I want to say as a chair of the discussion, the spirit of the discussion, is that this is what social scientists call essentially contested concept. It will have different meanings for different people, and the meanings will vary with context, and there will be no consensus. It's not possible to arrive at consensus with independent thinking people on a concept like this. Like we will never agree on what's art. We will never really will have an agreement on what is art, what is justice. These are essentially contested concepts, and that should be the spirit of the discussion, that we should try to learn from the arguments in the book. We may not agree with everything that they are saying, but there's still a lot to learn, because I read the book and I learned a few interesting facts and application of the ideas, the theories of populism to these 4 case studies. One interesting phenomenon about the scholarship in populism is that it's mostly focused on Europe and America, and a little bit on Latin America, because Latin America has a long history of populist politics, but not much beyond that. And I think that is an important gap that is worth considering, as the world has democratized a lot more. And this is a geographically more, diverse piece of work, that itself is something that speaks in its favor. It looks at countries from different geographies, very different kind of cultural, political histories. And I mean, it's very important because democracy works in different ways in different contexts. And that's again something that you get from Tocqueville and others, many others, that there is democracy in America, there's democracy in India, and at a particular time in America, at a particular time in India. So it's important to understand the specific context and histories, and each context matters, and we need much more of such kind of scholarship happening in this area. So now the way we'll run in this seminar is that Deepanshu and Abhinav will make a presentation for about 25-30 minutes to explain the arguments in the book, running through at least an overview and outline of the arguments. Then I'll invite Ambreen and Siddharth for offering comments for 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for a discussion.
All right, thank you, Suyash, and just get the presentation done. All right. This is working. Oh, sorry. Yeah. All right. So thank you so much, Suyash, Anirudh, Akash, and fellow discussants for joining in. I also want to thank Abhinav for coming all the way from Hyderabad to be part of this discussion. It's also something which was, I mean, we were in conversations for a few months about how to go about planning a discussion. The current, I must say this, that the current socio-political climate in which the book was written and come out, and like a small anecdote, a lot happened during the pandemic for a year with respect to one of the publishers who was not too keen in sort of going ahead with the project because we were focusing on India as one of the case studies as well. So this project has been in the wraps for, I think, since 2018, late of 2018. A lot of the people engaged with the center that I run back in general, along with a few colleagues, were involved in the process of initial ideation about how to look at some of the economic factors that lead to authoritarian tendencies amongst leaders, and then sort of how do they sustain power, over a period of time. And then, the conversation shifted from one point to the other about how they look at not just authoritarian, it was largely concept of populism. And as Suyash mentioned, it's a very contested concept, and much of what within the US is spoken of doesn't apply in that context to Europe, and what's happening in Europe may not just definitely apply to context of South Asia. And South Asian context is very important because the history of South Asia would tell you that there have been numerous occasions where populism and authoritarianism have sort of seen an entwined force, and to a certain extent in the intra-state dynamics, you do have strong men and strong women leaders in power, right, and sustained for a long period of time. And so how does the welfare state and the nature of the welfare state gets affected when you have certain leaders who are more authoritarian in nature or exhibit those characteristics? So a lot of things were discussed in the initial parts of the conversation on how to go about the book. Now, just to begin, and we'll try as much as possible, it was an ambitious scope. Dr. Ramchandra Guha at some point of time suggested that we should add Russia, delay the book by another year because we had to do a lot of research. We said you should look at also Putin, and nobody would know that you'd end up in a war, or Russia would be in that situation with Ukraine. So a lot of the biographical details required us to sort of look at different leaders, case studies of countries, their own political histories. Our own trainings are in diverse fields. I mean, Abhinav comes from a more international relations background, but my background is in economics and economic history. So for me, it was a lot of learning, and I was looking at almost everything under the scanner because my disciplinary limitations was, in this case, not a challenge, but an opportunity because I could look at so many areas of political sociology, political anthropology as well, and also political psychology. There's a lot of work that's happening now on what's going into the mind of leaders who are established as strong men or authoritarian figures, and how does that influence their decision making? So there are a few definitions just for context, and those who have joined online may be able to also get a sense of the content. What we're looking at largely are characteristics of a populistic movement based on one factor, which is that it's focused on leader. You have a populist leader who is not constrained largely by organizational rules and enjoys near total control of personnel and strategic decisions. There's a certain patronage that he or she may sort of exhibit. And the second characteristic is the way he, largely our case studies are looking at he, so talk about that in more reference on how we have to also sort of expand the gender notion of looking at more cases. But the mobilization of masses and how does that move around towards political ends is something which is more characteristic to generally most populist or populist literature or discourse. Our focus here is more on looking at what's happening with the ideological basis of populism. Is there a certain unchecked, unabated rise of a particular kind of ideology, and there's a marginalization of certain factions, what you would call as exhibition of majoritarian, totalitarian sort of thing, and at the same time, a current personality behavior that is infusing shades of populism to it. That's, I feel that in case of South Asia and case of Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Putin in Russia, all of those, you do see there is some sort of common parallel in the way that each of these, when they came into power and sustained period of time and sustained power, there were certain similarities that were there. Now, our focus here is not looking at just left or right branches of wings of populism. There is in the past a lot of emphasis on left ideological discussions on populist discourse within Latin America, particularly. And so you mentioned about how and why much of the import substitution industrialization strategy that happened post the Great Depression, in fact, right from the 1940s. A lot of literature that you saw a shift in Latin American politics post from that period onwards. We're looking at right-wing populism, but the distinct features of right-wing populism in context to what we are seeing now with the last post-2008 period is pretty unique. And we might want to sort of take a little bit of time in the discussion to say how this is different from what we've seen in the past. But our research was looking at largely 2 or 3 factors, I'll say. And the second was the factor which I was most interested in, is because how supply side economics, or famously like sort of the word you put is neoliberal economics, and notions of sort of prioritizing the market over state-led interventions were experimented upon by different regimes at different periods of time. And did it leave certain people better off or just at the margins? And if that divergence was created as part of discontents of supply side economic measures, or move towards hyperglobalization, did that leave certain communities to want for an alternative status quo in power? I think that's one of the things that personally for me was an important interest for research. But as you start doing the research for the case studies you want to identify, you look into historical context, trying to understand how populist leadership comes into being, right? And what is this kind of populist leadership that's coming largely from the cases of countries outside the North America, Euro-centric domain. So for that, you need one chapter which specifically talks about the political history of each of these cases. The third is a realization, and as Abhinav would sort of talk about some of these factors, as we were doing the research, we realized that most leaders we were looking at, for the case studies we identified, the role of the anti-corruption factor and the rise in religious conservatism or a certain kind of religious ideology or belief system was very centered to the way each of the leaders either came to power or were able to sustain power, right? So we were able to see with Brazil, India, Turkey, to a certain extent, even Russia, where corruption, public instances of corruption were a major determining or catalyzing factor. And we'll talk a little bit about this as we can. But I want to point out at some major limitations that the study faces. And we're all sort of here to take what critical feedback can help take the work forward in terms of identifying more case studies. But I feel a lot of the work came out in the pandemic. So a lot of the book was written in the pandemic. We did try to have as much of focus group conversations we could manage. But for Brazil particularly, there was a visit planned to FGV in Rio, and Turkey was also a place where we had planned visits to do some primary interviews with scholars. That couldn't happen just because of the limitations of that period of time. The book's ambitious in scope. I do a lot of work in ethnography. So context-dependent analysis is centered to a lot of the work we otherwise do at the center. So I'm aware that when you bring on the local context part, what's happening in India may not fit to the case of what's happening in Turkey and vice versa, but that's the nature of comparative politics. Sometimes you take a bird's eye view and sometimes you're trying to sort of make a sense of what's happening in the field, right, or at the local level. There's a language limitation here. We sort of largely looked at literature which is in English, which is limiting in its own way, because when you look at, for example, cases of Turkey or Brazil, not looking at other forms of literature which is available from different sets of organizational and institutional bodies, I think that somewhere limits your perception of the masses, right, of the people, of the leaders, what they think of them. So in case of India, we did make an effort to try as much as possible to be familiar with other languages as well and the other secondary resources, but other countries, we have this limitation. There is a lack of localized indigenous socio-political perspective. I would say that much of the discussion on the rise of leaders in the political past has very clear social and political ways of allowing for the rise of, let's say, Modi's in India, Erdogan in Turkey. So what are those factors and to what extent can we build upon the literature? I think there's a lot to be said on that. But in the book, we try to limit our observations to a few key verticals and few key axes. Sorry. Can you just move on to the next slide? Yeah, sure. Yeah. Now, this just to, before we get into the specific case studies, now, one of the key things you'd find in the book's research is that it's talking about how different attempts at liberalization or pro-market reforms were made by each of the countries, mostly in the 1990s, but there are different sort of periods of time in which each country is experimenting. So with Lula now who's back in power in Brazil, there is effort to undertake certain center-right or pro-market reforms. In Brazil, in cases of Russia, we have similar example. In India, we had that under the UPA 1 and 2, and there was a lot that was happening in the first term of the UPA. Now, what happened in the 90s, if you look at the period of time where the first sort of major effect was made to systemically move towards a pro-market set of reforms in certain sectors or partial capital account liberalization, so as to speak in the technical terms of reform, most of these efforts were also made in other countries at different periods of time. This affected upward mobility of particular classes and groups. It also affected the structural transformation story of each of the countries. And that's where the story of divergence really starts. And this is well documented in the literature. Some might say that, oh, this is well known. Yes, it's known, but how is having a political effect or a political economy effect most of these countries is less studied and understated to a certain extent. If you do a time series analysis, as in a long period of time, where you try to look at this. Corruption is a key factor which demands for a catalyzing effect of demanding change in a short period of time. It's not as if that a person like Modi or Erdogan or Bolsonaro just emerges out of the dark. They're in politics, they're in active politics for a long period of time, but there's a need for change, which comes, and where do they fit in terms of promising an alternative form of regime, which is all built on a Vishwas and Vikas motto. So this Vishwas and Vikas motto, which is need for providing change, is consistent in actually the political campaigns of all leaders when they are seeking to come in power. The idea of polarization or religious polarization is not at the center of the campaign. Somewhere that takes center stage when they are in power or they seek or they're ultimately in power at the center of the political regime. So the role of religious conservatism, corruption, discontents of economic liberalization, I think all are forces that are happening or underplaying at around the same time, right? So to look at it one in an isolated case of an economic causation effect or just a political or a social effect would be limiting. So with that, we'll just, you can just come in and maybe move forward with this, and we'll come back to the discussion on what we want to do in each case study.
Sure. So looking at the role of economic liberalization first, the period of 1980s and 1990s, we can see all of these countries experiment with efforts to liberalize their economies. Now, this eventually results in an empowered middle class and also affects the demographics of this nation, which is very important. I think as jobs and opportunities are created, we can see that urban migration increases. This migration, in conjunction with the rise of a new educated and earning middle class, changes the social environments of urban spaces, which until that point were, in a sense, dominated by a certain strata of society. This change really enabled the middle class to become a significant voice in their respective countries' politics, also paving the way for the changes in composition of the politics as well as leadership. So looking at India first, we can see that since the 1980s, there are liberalization efforts. The major motivation for the country was that it had been running twin deficits since the 1970s. As observed on the graph on the right, it depicts the gross fiscal deficit and the current account deficit as percentages of the GDP. A major facilitator of liberalization in the 80s was Rajiv Gandhi, who oversaw partial attempts of liberalization of economic policies. However, these efforts did not ease the economic concerns, and we later in 1991 have a major liberalization push under Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh. As part of these efforts, the rupee is floated, there's a free flow of foreign capital, public sector units are privatized, and quantitative restrictions on imports are removed. Now, looking at Turkey, Turgut Özal is the leader in the 1980s. He leads the liberalization efforts. He had previously worked with the World Bank and liberalizes the capital account. He removes restrictions on inflow and outflow of capital. He introduces new foreign exchange deposit accounts and the exchange rate to the Turkish currency. The introduction of foreign exchange account reduced demand for domestic currency, resulting in an increase in inflation. And this inflation period continues through the 1990s, as we can see in the graph, and only starts to reduce in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Now, Russia is a little different from the other countries because we're looking at two different nations, essentially, right? We're looking at the Soviet Union till the early 1990s, and then we're looking at Russia. The need to liberalize stemmed from the lack of consumer goods in the Soviet economy, because of which people did not know and did not have places to spend money and keep the economy rolling in a way. Gorbachev attempts to counter this using a two-stemmed approach. He uses the ideas of perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika means restructuring, while glasnost means openness. The main purpose of this is to have a semi-free economy and start competing with the West, because again, this is also the period where of the Cold War and actually towards the end of the Cold War. So fast forward to the 1990s, we see Boris Yeltsin undertake an ambitious liberalization program with a voucher program and a loan for shares program. Now, both of these are supposed to reduce income inequality, but it actually ends up exacerbating people's dissatisfaction because the inequality is actually increased and it creates the oligarchy system that is present even till today. Finally, looking at Brazil, Brazil's experiments with liberalization began a little earlier than other countries. In the 1930s, Getulio Vargas begins the experimentation with liberalization with the adoption of an import substitution program. This is followed by Kubitschek in the 1960s. He institutes something known as the 50-year and 5-year program, where he's trying to achieve 50 years worth of progress in 5 years. So one of the first steps that he does is the creation of an automobile industry and actually privatizing that. The next effort comes in 1990s with the Plano Real introduced by Itmar Franco. This effort to open up the economy is actually motivated by high rates of inflation, as can be seen in the graph. The Plano Real includes a plan to appreciate exchange rates, reduce the tariffs, and introduction of a crawling peg. he also privatizes a lot of the state-owned companies. Now, as Professor Deepanshu mentioned, we see corruption acting as a catalyst in all of these cases, right? So in India, we can see that despite UPA1 and UPA2's above average performance in terms of improvement in socioeconomic indices, corruption allegations and scandals acted as their downfall. This impacted the perception of middle and upper income sections that no longer would be just satisfied with employment and improved living conditions. These groups had benefited from the liberalization program undertaken in the 1990s, but their dissatisfaction grows with the corruption allegations. And as you can see from the graph, it really affects the people's perception of the government and eventually leads to their downfall. Now, in the case of Turkey, we can see that, again, the 1990s are a period of very high inflation, and people get exhausted by the continuous economic flux. The fact that major leadership and established leaders were embroiled in corruption allegations like the Turbank scandal and the Lost Billions scandal did not help people's perception. And there was a lack of confidence in the status quo leadership in the country. Eventually, this leads to a leadership vacuum, and people want a leader who prioritizes economic redevelopment, but also is a leader who stands for the same religious values in a sense. Now, looking at Russia, unlike other case studies, there is no specific instance of corruption that we can pinpoint, but there is systematic corruption that is all the way through Stalin's era. But the privatization under Yeltsin that we had mentioned earlier, like the loan for shares program, really exacerbated inequality and gave rise to the oligarch system. Now, the creation of this new oligarch system increased inequality. When combined with the increase in systemic corruption, as you can see in the graph, you can see that Russia's score in corruption perception index actually rises through the 90s. These two actually lead to a lack of confidence in leadership, and the people of the country look for new leaders. Now, Brazil has been ground for one of the largest political corruption scandals that the world has seen in recent past, the Petrobras scandal. This really changed people's perception with the government and also mobilized the public to look for a new leader. An estimate suggests that the scandal caused a loss of $27 billion, which is equivalent to 1% of the GDP. Now, the rise of religious conservatism is a major point that we're looking at. In India, we see the rise of a new form of politics, in a sense, with Hindutva, which is a mix of not just politics, but also religion. And it's the first time that we're seeing a concept like that. In the case of Turkey, we see the rise of Orthodox Islamism in political representation, a move away from Kemalism, which was their original political ideology through their inception. The Rising Tide of Conservatism is a book written by Ali Kargoglu. He takes a look at the rise of religious conservatism in Turkey, and he explains the socioeconomic changes within Turkish society, but also takes a look at how it affects leadership and political and economic changes within the nation. In Russia, we see an increased interdependence between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state. A great example of that would be with the recent invasion of Ukraine. We see the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church come out and back the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and he calls it a statement of God. Another interesting point to note is that Kirill, who's the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, was a former member of the KGB. In Brazil, you see an increased role that the Catholic Church has played in post-military rule Brazil. What we also see is that through the 90s and 2000s, there are changes within the societal structure as well. As you can see in the graph, there is an increased percentage of people who actually started recognizing themselves as Orthodox Christian within Russia, which also enables the leadership to play to a certain audience. We see the same in Brazil, where there's a 30 to 40% increase between 2002 to 2010 of people actually recognizing and calling themselves as evangelical Christians.
They were just, they were not allowed to say that earlier.
Yes.
There was a religiosity in Russia has sustained through the Soviet era.
Yes. So, yeah, looking at leaders in focus, what we see in all of our 4 case studies is that these leaders are presenting themselves as from the people and as a change from the status quo. We see 2 major things. First is an increased role of politics and religion from a very early age and being a major influence in these leaders' lives. What we also see is that although they present themselves as an alternative from the status quo and from the people, they've all held governmental positions at least provincial level before actually coming and becoming the heads of state. So with Narendra Modi is a member of the RSS at the early stage, but the event that brought him to national level prominence is him organizing the Rath Yatra along with LK Advani, which is, I think, one of the first sort of events of one of the first open religious events that you can see a political leader undertake. We see his rise as the Gujarat chief minister in early 2000s. Now the downfall of the UPA becomes the catalyst. He leverages social media and the prevalent perception against the UPA government and eventually becomes prime minister. Now, Tayyip Erdogan, again, very similar foundations, role of religion and politics we can see from a very, very early age. He joins religious party he joins one of the leading religious parties, the RP, at a very early age in his 20s, and he rises through the ranks of that political party. Eventually, when that political party is banned, he goes on to create his own party, which is the AKP. Societal friction and crackdown on dissent in the 1990s become a major catalyst for societal change, along with the economic impact that we can see that inflation had. Now, when combining both of these, it creates a leadership vacuum that Erdogan really takes advantage of and comes to power. Vladimir Putin, again, very similar. He joins the KGB. Eventually, after the downfall of the Soviet Union, he joins local level government in St. Petersburg. He is, again, in contrast to Yeltsin. Yeltsin is not perceived as a very strong leader. Putin puts himself in those shoes and has always tried to showcase himself as a very, very strong leader, and hasn't, unlike previous leaders, hasn't distanced himself from the Russian Orthodox Church or religion in any way. Now, finally, Jair Bolsonaro, again, becomes a member of the lower house of parliament in Brazil in the 1980s and remains a member of the parliament throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s as well. Now, the major catalyst is the Petrobras scandal, as the leaders the prime minister gets embroiled in that and has to resign. Bolsonaro sees this as an opportunity, again, with societal structures changing and the demography changing, as we can see an increased rise in people identifying as evangelicals. He uses that as a platform and becomes the preferred presidential candidate.
Yeah, so I mean, just to sort of take it in the last minute or so on which research questions we're looking, take it forward. There are 3 chapters assigned to each case study, and they're pretty expansive from one end to the other. With each leader, there's a biographical sketch done about their early life, what are the factors that are playing in mind towards their interest and motivation to be in politics. How is that influencing the nature of decision-making that they make later on in their lives? And I think that's where I think a possible area of further work is how you can use psychoanalysis or a psychoanalytical profiling of some of the leaders where there are a lot of similarities and all of them almost had a troubled childhood in terms of their relations, families at home, how they're seeking for some sort of a spiritual reckoning or realization in terms of the kind of institutions or religious organizations that they're joining, there is that factor which is almost common parallel to most leaders, and that's been sort of highlighted. A couple of key questions that emerged by the time that we were sort of in the final stages of looking at the research is there are relationships between populism, authoritarianism, or the nature of the welfare state, which is in varying degrees reflecting, the good, bad, and ugly prisms. It's not as if that everything is going wrong in the way, for example, there's no value judgment attached that, just because Modi's come into power, everything has gone wrong. It's just is the fact. What are the underlying forces that is sustaining a vast majority of the electorate to feel that they find that having a leader like Modi or Erdogan is benefiting the welfare state or the access of basic socio-economic services? You see in the rural areas, the voice is very clear. UP election is another instance, right, with Yogi Adityanath. So there is something which is the underlying current, which I feel a lot of us tend to miss because we're looking at the binaries of populist leadership working to the advantage or disadvantage of the community. There is evidence that Naveen Patnaik, for example, who was at the state level for very long, has had very clear, or Mamata Banerjee, a certain kind of leadership in power, has yielded a sustained electoral majority continuously and has not had that anti-incumbency as the way many other leaders would have had. So there are certain, I think, trends that needs contextual or context-dependent analysis. The other thing is we need more case study focused narratives. The idea of looking at these four big countries was they're strategically important actors in their respective regions. We mentioned it in the initial parts of the book because anybody would ask why we've looked at only these four case studies. Strategically, India matters in South Asia, Brazil, and Latin America, Russia. Its own importance is pretty well known. In the same case with Turkey, Central Asia, West Asia, and it has had strategic importance. Research methodology is, I think, an area that for us, at least for me, there was a lot more of nuance that's possible. But the publishers in this case were very clear that the book has to be for students who are coming at largely an undergraduate or a later undergraduate level. So the language could not, beyond a point, go into exploring using other complex or existing sort of models which have already established a lot of impact assessment of populist leadership. So our methodology had to depend on largely a CDA or a critical discourse analysis, focus group discussions, to make the language more coherent and structured in that manner. I think as we begin the conversation going forward with the discussions, one of the reflections we're looking at is now to take that critical feedback and assess that to what extent the kind of verticals we are coming out from, looking at the case studies we've identified, where can the work go forward? So religious conservatism, the fact around that was not an originally highlighted factor. We realized that how important it was over a period of time, looking at the sustained rise in power for each of the leaders. So we're looking at some of these as we go. So I look forward to your feedback and thank you. Stop it. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepanshu. Thank you, Abhinav. Ambreen.
Hi, everyone. I'll start by first congratulating the authors, Deepanshu and Abhinav, for bringing out this very important book that deals with the topical issue of our times, which is the rise of populist politics across the global north and the global south. And this book undertakes a study of the four countries, India, Russia, Brazil, and Turkey. And it documents a shift in the center of gravity, the political center of gravity towards right-wing authoritarian populism and politics. And in order to understand the political economy of the society, I have used the framework of power to analyze this book, how power basically exists and operates in society, because this very book talks about the state-society relationship. And in order to understand, we see that power is at the leadership position. We see there is anxiety of power, and there is also power you also understand power in terms of contestation for resources. And this, of course, talks about at the level of society. So what's happening at the level of society? And it is the former, which is anxieties of power of the political leadership, that basically feeds into the insecurities that arise out of this contestation. And this contestation for resources like intellectual, economic, or cultural, political. And because we're all differently placed in society. And based on that different locations, social locations, we see how populist leaders have come to exploit that gap which exists. And this tells us how anxieties of power shares a relationship, or rather it's intertwined with the anxieties of uncertain future that exists among the society, in the society. And basically there is also a very deep sense of abandonment that stems from the erstwhile politics, liberal politics. And I think so Abhinav was talking about how religion was something which people could not profess in Turkey or in Russia. And there are analysts who now say that both of them have given religion back to its people. So there was this kind of abandonment, alienation among the masses, which you see this is basically what explains the broad social base that the populist leaders have managed to develop for themselves, that they have been able to have. And in securing this support base, we see that there's a kind of language which is employed in politics. And this language largely is exclusionary in nature and very past-oriented politics, specifically in the case of India, we see, and which resorts to culture and also rests on the idea of otherization. So there is a constant construction of the other. And so in this book, we see how power is manifested through ideological and cultural means. And what also they write is, and there's emphasis on the formalization, I'm quoting the formalization of religion in the political sphere. And this was happening in Turkey, wherein Islam was, there was a repoliticization of Islam. And that was basically used to bring together divergent interests. And these divergent interests were brought together because there was this fear of fragmentation. So to prevent fragmentation of the family, of the nation, of the state, the repoliticization of Islam was something which was resorted to. And when we talk of this, it's very important to also think about the question of legitimacy as to what kind of political institutions or how do political institutions play a role in legitimizing social conservatism. And because social conservatism, we see it cleaves existing social hierarchies. We already have social hierarchies. And with this kind of social conservatism, there is an inflation by producing and reproducing others. And who is this other? In case of India and Brazil, for instance, we see that the national and the immigrant minorities are projected as the antagonistic other. So you are either a disruption to the order, or you are a burden to the existing resources. So for instance, in case of India, the Muslim past or the Muslim present is a disruption to the continuity of the ancient glorious Hindu past. And similarly in Brazil, we see that the immigrant is framed as a burden on the economy, hence the society. And hence there is this rise in populist sentiments. And it is this demonization of minorities, both national and immigrant, that gives legitimacy to conservative politics of the right wing. And it actually has led to further fragmentation of society. And it's visible because we see a rise in vigilante groups. And the authors mention about the cow protection movement and how the cow vigilante groups attack minorities like Dalits and Muslims. And then you have the xenophobic attacks on migrant camps in Brazil, on Syrian refugees in Turkey. So this is the demonization. This kind of demonization has actually further fragmented society. And this is happening because, of course, there's always been the whole practice of securitization. So the securitization around identities, and which, of course, is not the making of only the populist leaders, which also has its history in the liberal politics. So this everyday violence now we see is a result of identities being securitized or securitization of identities around the social hierarchies that exist. And that is why this violence, whether it's in the form of racism, it's xenophobia, communalism, or homophobia for that matter, has been normalized. And this is where gender as an axis of power comes into play. And I think so this week or last week, the Indian government had opposed same-sex marriage and upheld the heterosexual Indian family unit. So, and similarly, we see in Turkey, in Russia, and in Brazil, leaders have had similar kind of sentiments against or views against same-sex marriage. This approach, which the strong men basically adopt, is there for a reason. Why? Because it actually positions them favorably among their supporters. And the supporters mainly come from cis hetero middle class men, and who, in the words of authors, in the case of Brazil, draw to Bolsonaro's macho narrative. And that viewed homosexuality against Brazil's Judo-Christian tradition. And in Russia too, Putin had introduced constitutional amendments that defined marriage as a union of a man and a woman. And this was upheld by the Russian Orthodox Church. So this is how we see that Putin has used the church to strengthen his rule and his position. And in case of Turkey also, in the same breath, we see the top leadership, the top ministers have espoused views that are anti-LGBTQ. And in fact, they say that the LGBTQ movement is hurting the family values. And of course, these family values stem from their understanding of Islam and its infusion in politics. So this is how we see that patriarchal power is manifested through supporting social conservatism that weaponizes heteronormative masculinity, that weaponizes heteronormative femininity in pursuit of populist politics. And in the process, preserving the family. So family becomes an integral part for state's survival. And this is because the family has a functional role. It basically plays the ideological function of the state. And at this point, I think it's also very important to look at the role of media and social media that the authors talk about in the rise of populist politics across the 4 countries. And so basically what's happened before Modi or Putin came to power, we see that there was a media bias in favor of these leaders. And also there was fake news, dissemination of fake information because of social media. And this basically elevated the status of these authoritarian leaders. For instance, Erdogan and Modi positioned themselves as economic reformers. And this was happening with the constant assistance of the media. So in 2014, the media had presented Modi as a pro-business leader, which also basically then leveraging the Gujarat model as the ideal model which can be replicated across the country. So the elite and which includes the upper middle class and the middle income group, they also lend their support to Modi in the hope that he would help the economy and recover it from the endemic, rampant corruption of the Congress-led UPA, because corruption was tied to the Congress-led UPA. So that's why Modi became important, because he was projecting himself and the media was projecting him as an economic reformer. And I'll end here. I have one question. Basically, when we look at the politics of gender, and we've seen, and both of you argue that how it's the men, upper class, and in India's case, upper class men, middle class men who support this particular kind of politics. So where do we see the role of women in the rise of populist politics? And secondly, given that Lula's return, do you think it can have a ripple effect across the populist countries that you have studied. And once again, I congratulate both of you. And because this book really tells us about the social taxonomies of class, gender that exist, and which is basically the substratum on which populist politics is built upon. So yeah, thank you, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Think to reading what Abhinav was saying, patriarch blessing Russian troops just as they were about to go to Ukraine, and it just reminded me of one of things that Huntington wrote a long time ago, that in Islam God is Caesar, in China Caesar is God, and in Russia God is Caesar's junior adjunct. So it just made me think that what would happen to all these gods in India, millions of them, where would they go, but I won't say much about the other three countries because I have very little knowledge about them. So the first thing is that you mentioned that the rise of religious conservatism is linked with corruption in the political system, and it's used to sustain authoritarian leaders once they make use of corruption as a kind of a political, shall we say, they use corruption to come to power, and then they use religion to stay in power. So do you think, I'm sorry, I have more questions than comments. So do you think that religious conservatism is largely a product of corruption and religious conservatism in politics, the role of religious conservatism in politics, that you need corruption in the political system for that sort of thing to rise? That's one issue. And I suspect that's more salient in the case of both India and Turkey, which are very conservative societies and which have had religion and politics for such a long time. But it's only now in India since 2014, although you've had a India government back in 2000, in the late 90s and early 2000s, but I don't think that at that time religion was such a issue. So, I mean, what would you guys say about that? Although it's from the same parties. That's one. In your chapter on India, and the drift which I get is that India is headed towards authoritarianism, some sort of authoritarianism and centralization of power. Where would you locate agency in this system? At the very top, at the level of the electorate, or and how would you contrast it with non-religious, non-conservative political formations, which have been around for about a quarter of a century, from 1989 till about 2014? And if indeed agency lies at the top, as I suspect that you are hinting towards that, then the bigger question is that why is so much of energy being spent in each election? I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's a Lok Sabha election or it's a ward election or whether it's a municipal election. I mean, the level of money, political energy which is cast into these campaigns is phenomenal. I've not seen. I've been watching Indian politics for now almost 25 years. I've never seen this kind of a thing except for the last 7-8 years. I mean, it just makes me wonder, where is agency in India? Is it with the electorate? In case the system is so authoritarian, or let's not say it's so authoritarian, if it's the drift is towards authoritarianism, where is the need to, why not just turn it into some kind of a default mode that yes, you go for elections, but it doesn't matter. But apparently in this system, it does matter. I mean, each election is like a referendum on the government. So what do you guys have to say about that? I also read a little bit somewhere about where you say that a number of problems have crept up ever since Modi has been in power. For example, centralization, cooperative federalism has gone down. I'm not very sure whether cooperative federalism was indeed some sort of a normative constitutional feature of the Indian polity. I think it emerged during a period when you had very weak central governments and where power actually de facto moved to states where you needed, even to sustain governments, you needed regional parties. So I'm not very sure whether we can say that this is the end of cooperative federalism, because I don't think that India was ever really a federal country. You know, if you look back from 1947 until about 1989, I mean, you look at any constitutional feature which is of a centralizing nature, be it Article 356 or 249, which is the center legislating in state lists if it is required. Look at the extensive use of Article 249 in Kashmir. So I'm not very sure whether I would really worry about cooperative federalism as some sort of a thing which is being destroyed. It's just, I suspect it was a political feature which may emerge again, which may not, and it's basically a creature of political exigencies. I think those were the three questions that I had in mind. And then the other thing is that you mentioned that this kind of conservative religious nationalism is largely a middle-class phenomenon, right? But if you look at Modi, and in the last 8 odd years, he's been very, very careful. I mean, I would look at it and I barely find any difference in terms of the way he spends money on poor. The same kind of populism which existed during the last governments, UPA 1 and UPA 2, probably even more massively so, you know. So I'm just trying to understand that those governments were populists too, and this one is too. So where is the distinction, you know, where we say that, is it that you're trying to make political populism as a distinct category as compared to just economic populism?
Thank you, Siddharth. We'll open up for questions, and there are a couple of questions that we've got online, which I will also read out. But I also want to make a few comments and questions. So one point, I mean, is that the book, I think, in some ways rightly focuses on leaders and leadership of this type, right? Because in the classic theory on populism, whether it's Cass Mode or Rosanwala, basically focus on this leader and the people. You know, that's the kind of dynamic that works. And then people versus the others, as Ambreen also said. These are two different key dynamics that kind of work out in the populist politics. But I think there are important distinctions, right? In these 4 case studies, Modi significantly, if you disagree with debated, the creature of the party and the organizations that he comes from. And the rise of BJP predates Mr. Modi's rise as Prime Minister. In September 2013, he becomes a candidate, face of the party. But before that, there's a rise. If you look at the rise of BJP, it's a significant social base and create for itself. There's a critical moment. There's a critical election in 2014, perhaps. There's a realignment that happens. But the rise of BJP as one of the 2 poles of Indian politics in the coalition era is something that predates him. Even Erdogan, to a large extent, is a creature of the party, although he's taken over, he has much more control over the party, perhaps. And in that sense, I think the Brazilian case that you've chosen, and anyway, he's now out of power, he didn't belong to any of the top 2-3 parties, right? He is a complete, in some ways, rank outsider. And the Russian party politics works very differently in itself. So, I mean, Mr. Putin cannot be compared to these. So, how much should we focus on the personalities and the leadership, and how much the parties' growth, and because in some ways the rise of AKP at that time, Erdogan was hardly a nationally popular figure, but he constructed in the late 90s and early 2000s, constructed that party out of what was actually a very small set of votes. The party that he built out of was 15% vote share, and in 3 years he took it to basically a party which won a majority, almost a majority in the Turkish assembly. So that I think is important to understand the distinction of party and leaders, because a lot of populist conversation is about leaders, but parties also can transform. And then that challenges the theory itself, because populism works through movements, leader commanding the masses in something, mobilizing and standing for the general will. And you also refer to some of that theory. But if it's a party which has thick ideology, it's not the thin ideology of the populism, which has actually been carrying that ideology for 80 years, 90 years in some cases. In Erdogan's case, a party is new, but that sentiment of kind of a antithesis to the Turkish secularization has long predated. It goes back to the days of Kemal Atatürk and so on. Second issue I think it's worth considering is the question of staying in power as a populist, because there's a movement and then there's governance. You can do a lot of poetry in the movement and campaign phase, but once you start governing, and out of this 3, 4, one is already out of power, but the other 3 have sustained power now for a long time. And what does it take to sustain power in this way? Siddharth ji mentioned, and you've shown data about how the support for BJP grew among the middle classes and the upper middle classes and middle classes. But if you look at 14 to 19, the vote share based on NES among the lowest 20% of the voters gone to 24 voters, 36%. So the construction of the first government may have been based on what you said, but the staying in power, which is the 2014 to 19, exercise of power to continue after 2019 is different. It's not about so much because the largest share, vote share comes from the lower income household.
Actually, they show it. They show in their data.
They show 2009 to 14.
Yeah.
And the 14 to 19. Yeah.
It's a different trend.
It's a different trend. Staying in power. Similarly, if you look at Putin's governance, initially in 2000, there was an increase in inequality. Incomes were rising. Incomes were rising throughout his tenure since he has been in power. But now, in the 2010s, there's been a decline in inequality as measured by measures like Gini coefficient and all. So they are doing different things to stay in power, and that adaptiveness of some of the leaders is worth understanding, because one of the 4 lost power after just one term, and the others are able to stay out. So do they remain populist in that, or are they actually solving some of the problems that people are? They become more like policy oriented leaders, and they become much more of a typical democratic leaders in some senses. We can debate that, but the question is there some kind of a dilution of the so-called populist kind of model that is going on? Third point is very much, I think it's a very important contribution. I've read some of the work on populism in the West, and some of the best theories, they don't even talk properly about religion. They talk about culture, but not religion, because their societies are highly secularized in many ways, US being an exception. But we have secular states and very religious societies. And it's at least in Turkey and India, that's been quite true for a very long time. And we can see this as a kind of a basis on which mobilization can happen. And it's a very important kind of point to further dwell on. More research is required on this. Even Russia, as we said, you couldn't see, there was a lot of preference falsification during the Soviet era, when you couldn't even mention what your religious standing was. After that, the big explosion of, professed religiosity and increase in the rise of the Orthodox churches and so forth. Brazil, I don't know whether this is as true. Bolsonaro's appeal is whether primarily religious or even religion plays a very important role is a questionable thing. But other countries, certainly, this is something which can be said. And what does that tell you about democratic politics? That, what is the nature of the state that has become so secularized, that has become disconnected from some of the concerns of the masses that can express in this way? Are there accommodations that were not made earlier on that made it possible to get to this? An important point, I think the group has the most important point is about corruption. I think there are critical moments in which anti-corruption becomes a basis for mobilization and exercise of state power, which very interestingly, what we don't study enough is whether there was genuine corruption or not. There's a perception of corruption. There are accusations to very large scandals, but was there any that we never go back to look at? And ultimately, politics is fought on perceptions. So perception is what matters. How was that perception generated? I think that's where the social media plus corruption plus the role of certain kind of civil society organizations is useful. That's an important point. I'll stop here. I'll read a couple of the comments that were made online, and then we'll take comments in the room. One question that has come is, how has the caste equation helped Mr. Modi led BJP win consecutive elections with something majority? Does a similar pattern exist in Turkey, Brazil, or Russia? Is there any equivalent of caste there? Like it is said in some other countries, there are equivalents of caste or something parallel to it. I don't know, make it what you want to make of it. This second question is, the BJP government allowed the Khalistan flag to be hoisted on the Red Fort and withdrew the farm laws which were supported by 86% of farmers. Instead of calling Mr. Modi a weak man, why do you refer to him as a strong man and populist? I mean, you have to answer that question. And on YouTube, we got a question. What's your opinion on the role of judiciary in India vis-a-vis other three countries? What's your opinion on the role of free media, television and print in India vis-a-vis other three countries? It's a broad question. You've already addressed some of it in the book. On Zoom, we have another question. How do you conceptualize populism? Putin is an authoritarian leader, a conservative dictator, a strongman savior, but what makes him a populist? You know, because Putin is a different case and Russian politics is very different. He's been always part of the elite and was elevated to power directly through Yeltsin's endorsement. Liberalization from the 90s may have expanded the middle class, but also left others behind, including parts of middle and working classes. Populism is increasingly a useless term, but that's another discussion. And that's on that note, it's a fitting end to the set of questions.
The last one, sorry. What is the last thing?
Populism is increasingly a useless term, but that's another discussion. This is a comment by the same person who's asked about Putin being many things, but not populist, because his rise to power wasn't.
No, I do. I do see that.
So many questions. If you want to add, we can just.
I think we'll lose track unless they answer the first round.
Yeah, so I'll take a combination of all the comments that all of you made and look at the last question first, like what makes Putin a populist. Now, if you look at a point that you mentioned at the very beginning, democracies inherently are populist to a certain extent. I mean, they're all based on popular vote, right? So when you have an election system that is based on the popular vote, you are eventually going to have populist leaders. I mean, in a way, it is gaming the system, right? You're just trying to find the path of least resistance to get to the most people and trying to get the number of votes. Now, as far as looking at Putin, number one, I would disagree with the comment that he was always elite. He comes from a very middle class or low middle class background and eventually makes it to the KGB and rises through the ranks from there. So it's a very similar path.
No, he's not saying he's elite.
Yeah,
He's saying that
He's populist
or not.
yeah, coming to that point. Now, what makes him populist is, again, we're coming down to, if we take one specific incident, right? We take the invasion of Ukraine specifically. Now, for a leader in the position of Vladimir Putin, where, I mean, whether it's a democracy or not is debated and what kind of vote count, the very fact that he felt the need for the Orthodox Church to back a movement like that says that to a certain extent, he is looking at the people and their perception because he feels that if that changes, his leadership is in threat, right? So the people do have an inherent say, or at least he believes so, because if he didn't, then that point is moot, right? So he can go with the invasion without the backing of the church. That's not really needed for him. He can go with that or without that. But the very notion that he needs that, and even when we're looking at movements maybe within Russia, right? When you have opposition that is rising within Russia, there is a very, very quick stop to it and making statements such as this person is a foreign agent, this person is doing this on behalf of whatever other countries, itself makes it populist, right? You're talking about an us versus them, the elite versus the others. So I think inherently that there is a certain populist element to it. Now, again, when you look at the Russian system, it is a democracy. I mean, I wouldn't call it a well-functioning democracy, but it is a democracy. There are elections that happen, right? So there is populism even in Russia, but again, to what extent is debatable.
It is a democracy in the sense that, yeah, it has with a moderate quality score. But the question is whether Putin's politics is populist or not.
Yeah, again, when you look at the statements that he makes against opposition, when you look at the fact that he is actually looking for support to make moves or make decisions, it does make him populist. I mean, yes, he is authoritarian.
That any leader in democracy would see.
Yeah, so I mean, see, I'll tell you what most of the, and I mentioned it towards the end, that the link between populism and authoritarianism is a blur somewhere. We used to go a lot back and forth on this, that do we use the word authoritarianism or sometimes we use the word populism, because there is a certain kind of leadership style, which is one in which you have an authority-centered disposition of power. And Ambreen was talking about power structures. It's very interesting to see how that anxiety that's created around that control might be left out of my hand, right? As against, the style of leadership that, for example, Erdogan had. Erdogan didn't come in hard at the very initial term of his power, right? There's a whole journey where the most analysis or the information we have on different kinds of populist, governance styles is, Erdogan's case is very interesting from how he starts and how he, controls the masses at this point of time. So there is a context dependent analogy there, that where in certain cases, much like in Russia, you have much more of an authoritarian exhibit of control in power. Do you deem that as populist or not? There is an intrinsic motivation in each of the leaders to be loved, appreciated by the masses and the majority of what they're doing. And that's coming to the question of legitimacy and trying to be in power for a long period of time. You see that with Bolsonaro as well, where he starts losing the people largely during COVID and his comments on women. And there the sort of the gendered notion of losing that majority in power for Bolsonaro in the elections. He in fact wrote about this, saying that there are conditions under which Bolsonaro was failed once he came to power to uphold a lot of things that we had spoken about, which is the point on there's a lot of poetry said, and things could not move in that direction. And the last 2 years led to him sort of losing that control. In Modi's case, it's actually very interesting because you do have a welfare state and a redefined notion of a welfare state reimagined, much like what you saw in Indira Gandhi, where the extreme poor are provided with public goods and resources, which makes the class of the rural electorate to feel that there is an agency or the location of that agency in the leader. And you saw with Indira Gandhi's Garibi Hatao Andolan, a lot of times you had between Modi and Indira Gandhi, there are a lot of battles. Now, in state elections, the dynamic is very different. And you see that evidence. BJP has not done that well in state elections where you already had a sort of quote-unquote authoritarian populist leader in power who established to balance the welfare state by taking care of a lot of social security welfare. So West Bengal was one case, Odisha is another, or many others that one can sort of look at. There are a lot of other factors as well, but one of the key factors is that wherever there was a disconnect between the low middle income classes, which was largely BJP's vote much before 2014, is a redefined notion of who's your major group. Now, one very good example is the free ration extension of the scheme. Now, just see that what's happened. UP elections were largely fought and won on the fact that COVID mein kuch nahi ho paya, and the fact that we had free ration coming in was a sign that the state was trying to do something as a support mechanism. Whether it worked or not worked doesn't matter. The notion was we need to continue doing this. And now it's been continued for another year, where independent of whether it is for taking care of quote unquote the poor, the fact that it's helping from a point of getting more votes from the lower community of class composition is a matter. Now, I think class is a big factor here, not just caste, but there is a caste class sort of interwoven fabric here in the social dynamics of power and its access to power, where certain agency is disposed in different communities feeling different things about Modi is able to do. If you really ask the question, which is the question you asked on where do you locate the agency, I think the agency you would locate it largely in the South Asian context, and to a certain extent, I would say Brazil is another example, and so is Russia. I wouldn't say Turkey is to that same level. My knowledge on Turkey is remained, so you might know more. is the big capital and state nexus, where you would find that largely the elections or the sustenance of power is built around that. The leader who balanced the needs of being pro-business or being pro-big capital and could sustain that support from that class of investors for a long period of time was able to find himself to be in power for a longer period of time because you could generate the amount of money that was there. You had the oligarchic rent-seeking behavior control in Russia, which is very well established. Putin has a class of loyalist business. I mean, you see that in China. China has a very similar. Now, where and to what extent, how do you locate the question of agency there? I think conceptually, we are in midst of looking at this, how and to what extent, for example, an Adani and Ambani, right, is redefining the nature or the composition of the elite, business elite, and the political elite, right? So I mentioned this towards the end, right? How the elite behavior itself changes once you have a strong man coming in power, right? Many people who are sort of now very freely talking about religion and religious beliefs and identity, but not talking about this before, right? We're not talking about this before, but now you have people you consider in the Indian context, Marwadi community, for example, which does a lot of business networking capital, very clear on political disposition that this is the party we hope for and we want it to win. And our support is very clear. There is much more explicit support for a leader and for a particular party, which in the previous context, and of course, much before a period of time, was not explicitly established. So there's some change underlying that current force which is there. We also observed this as part of the conversations that were happening from different ends, which is how in India elections are being won by a particular party which has been around for a very long time, but has seen the party's organizational dynamics has changed over a period of time, much post 2014, where the centralization of power at the beginning is controlling the dynamics, but you don't have that backward and forward linkage with state machinery to that side. Now, cooperative federalism, the point you made on that, I think that's a very important. Somewhere there is an evidence of weaponization of fiscal priority and power, which you can say has been utilized in the past also. And this is not a very temporal phenomenon. You have examples where Siddharth was in the finance minister that certain states for allocations of certain schemes were conditionally not given support mechanisms unless they fixed certain panels. Now it's very clear. And the idea is that, for example, Tamil Nadu, you just saw the Hindu sort of coming out with the column, how much Tamil Nadu is contributing to the share and how much Tamil Nadu is getting back. It's, I think, an evidence in point where a lot of the ways in which fiscal support mechanisms and parameters have been determined, a lot of those parameters were there before and it's there now. Where the states feel more in consensus or more distanced with those in power at the center, that I think mapping is not very clear. And that confusion that has sort of stemmed up now, particularly during COVID, was unlike ever seen before, because you had a central government or a union government, which made sure that in certain parallels of support mechanisms, you would have resources no matter allocated. My sense is we're not very clear whether the fiscal power of the union government itself is to what extent intact to what it was 6 or 7 years back. And a lot of people are talking about this already. I mean, National Institute of Public Finance touched a couple of people where they're saying that the numbers on fiscal deficit in itself, you have to see that there's a lot of latent fiscal deficit that can be there, and we don't have a clear clarity on it. So there is some evidence of weaponization, which of funds and allocation of funds, which is emerging over a period of time. Whether that reduces cooperative federalism or destroys the ethos of that, I think that it's difficult to sort of say from one sort of period of time. There's no this. I mean, there are a lot of questions that were put in, but I just one or two points that I felt that what I mentioned was, which gives us a very good template for looking at things forward in the way the research is structured is on 2 points. On the the violence point, on the securitization of identities that is mentioned. I think that was a point which was becoming evident with how the feeling of communities to identify with their religious, social, political disposition became more and more evident over a period of time. Is interesting as part of, I think, a global phenomenon. It's not restricted to these case studies alone. There is a systemic change of disconnect being felt by different communities at different points of time. And somewhere it is rooted in the discontents of globalization, that you have a global citizenship or a global identity, which the anti-immigrant or the anti-Muslim or the anti-entity is established. And it's beyond caste. It is very gendered. In India's case, you will find that you have a huge support, for example, enjoyed by Modi amongst women of a certain community and class and caste disposition as well. It's very evident. I think very good example was UP elections for me to sort of understand how, despite certain dispositions of communities feeling alienated from having no access to economic or social resources, their support of establishing political identity for a particular individual was very clear. That was not to be compromised. So I think somewhere looking at the notion of violence, securitization of identities, and weaponization of public institutions, these two are distinct features of right-wing populism that I feel is independent of the trends that we might have seen in the past. The extent to which you're seeing centralization of power has happened before in much of populism, authoritarianism, but what's happening in the front of identities and gender notions of power, I think this is something which is emerging out to be very. You saw a lot of the movements, for example, in India, the CA-NRC movement, a lot of the resistance in Iran, in Turkey, being led by women protesters. In fact, there was the lost of the grassroots movements for women-led movements, if I'm reading from civil society. So there is clearly a certain agency which has been not tapped into in the social identification of groups, which is now being felt. Now, it is interesting because in the first time we had a discussion in the UK around the text, we had a scholar there talking about, well, in the UK case, it's a very interesting analogy because you have conservative women leaders who are in power, and they have a very different sort of a control or exercising of agency in that right. So, I mean, as you look at more case studies, maybe Hun Sen in Cambodia, but if you look at Margaret Thatcher, Theresa May, can you see them in the same sort of populism, authoritarianism vibe? I think that's something we'll have to see. The last point, which I'll just sort of mention, is on the point of what Suyash was mentioning, that where I think leadership and the party person. So I think there is a sphere of influence which is established by the cult of personality, which we are sort of initially trying to identify. That we look at ideological populism, and that's the conceptual pillar which we are largely sort of building on, right? That there is ideology, and that ideology is a sustainative force of power, and that ideology has to be, it's a non-negotiable sacred instrument. The party's position on establishing that ideological core is the same before and after. And there is what we use economics, a difference in difference analysis parameter. There is some change in the party's politics and inter or intra-party organizational structure once each of these leaders are coming in center of the movement. Now, to what extent can you look at that from the analysis of what's happened in the party? I think there's a separate research question which one can definitely look at. What's happened to the BJP's party organizational structure as a whole? एक ब्राह्मण बनिया जो एक class को ये cater करता था. Is it that that's completely changed, or is it exactly the same? Well, a lot of people might argue it's pretty much the same in many parts of the Hindi heartland, but it's changed the dynamics in how the BJP negotiates in the Northeast, for example, what are the factors leading to that? But again, as I said, it's a very difficult analysis when you're doing comparative politics, which is so context dependent. In the Indian context and Brazil, for example, Brazil's case, when we were having conversations with different scholars, it was such a coin toss, with some of the factors being that, yes, corruption has played a very important role in Bolsonaro's campaign, right? But to what extent Bolsonaro was still enjoying popular majority support, even post loss, there was a lot of resistance on the vote being a fair vote or not a fair vote, because there's a group of voters who are loyalists to the individual to the extent that doesn't matter. You're legitimately voting for that or not. Trump has had similar effect in the US. Now, that's an unexplained, or it's an unknown, or like you don't know what's driving that. Some answer to that is in the religious conservative debate, that they're catering to that particular group, which feels alienated and victimized. Nobody hears them out, and we can sort of see that. But I think there are so many factors which are interwoven that to separate one and say that there is reverse causality or interlinked causality there, it becomes a challenge. So I cautioned, or we were very well aware that we don't say that rise in religious conservatism and corruption are two factors that are leading to one to the other. In fact, all three are factors that are allowing an individual to come to power, and then over a period of time, depending on the context, they're using one to sustain power as a factor. CNRC was seen in the first or second years of the second term of the BJP coming in power. I think it was very clear. You might see a uniform civil code related discourse that next 2024 thing. So there is clearly an ideological disposition which is underplayed and heavily played over a period of time. You see that the census has been cancelled, right? So that there is clearly something which is at an undercurrent, pulled up as soon as you have the 2024 votes. So how do we look at ideological populism as a variant of discussion conceptually and localize that in context to the case studies we've identified? That's an objective that we're trying to meet from a research perspective. But there are so many context-dependent factors that will be difficult to look at.
Yeah, I think looking at one last question, I think there was a question on are there similar factors in other countries similar to caste politics in India? I think to the point that you mentioned of context-dependent sort of narratives. You look at Brazil, I mean, there is a clear sort of difference between the way leaders approach whites and blacks. There's a race equation over there. When we look at Russia, it's religion. It's Orthodox Christians versus Jews. When we look at Turkey, it's very interesting because it's ethnicities. Are you Turkish from the Ottoman descent? Are you Armenian? Are you Syrian? Are you Cypriot in ethnicity? So in the case of Turkey, especially, it's very interesting because Erdogan's power to a huge extent is centralized towards Istanbul and Ankara. As you start moving towards the borders, whether it's Armenia, whether it's Cyprus, whether it's Syria on the south, we see opinion poll results show that there is a loss of confidence and there is a lowered confidence over there. But since the population is sort of centered and towards Istanbul and Ankara, because those are your sort of economic strongholds, that's where your voting base really is, and that's where Erdogan is really done.
We have a few minutes to go. You have a question?
Yeah, so I just had an observation, which is that it's worth considering. We started off by saying it's a contested idea and there's no clear agreement on what populism means. So it might be worth thinking about the fact that populism also arises as a dialectical political process in response to what pre-existed before it, right? And in a lot of these societies, basically politicians, at least in India, had narrowed down the scope of what constituted politics and political campaign. So the idea was you deliver on economic growth and you deliver on economic reforms, and whoever does best is going to be good at it, and you do some amount of redistribution, right? But a lot of these populist leaders have basically fought and found new spaces that were given up by older political parties or the elites in the older political system, which is the role of religion and religion in society, cultural issues, and so on. Right. So they've also been able to capture that space which was given up by the older political system or political party. So then is it fair to say that this is basically a rise of populism, or is it basically recapturing of political spaces that had been emptied out earlier?
Any other questions?
An element of the counterculture.
Any other question from the room? I just think
Yeah,
we're running off. Any other question from the room?
Yeah.
So populism has a tendency to differentiate between the pure people
Yes.
and the elite class.
Yeah.
Right? And we know that Marxist analysis also employs a similar differentiation between the elite of the dominant class and the working class. So do you think that populism is liberal democracy's response to the Marxist challenge?
I have a quick comment and then a question. The comment was about Brazil. You mentioned the prominent role of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church had strongly associated with things like divorce, abortion, and so on. But in recent years, the influx of evangelical Christians, mainly from the US, that has completely reshaped the dynamics and the kind of extremism that they espouse. You saw with Bolsonaro supporters and all, that is completely another level to what the Catholic Church has been, even at the height of their power. So I just want to make the distinction. In terms of question, I don't know if you have time to discuss the two other important cases, Philippines and Hungary, where in Philippines we don't see the religious narrative playing into the strongman. We see the strongman rule, and one strongman surprisingly replaced by another who could be even worse. And in fact, the president went against the Catholic Church in easing rules for abortion and so on. While in Hungary, we see this cultural ethno-nationalist cultural conservatism, but we don't see the associated economic decline preceding that situation with the joining of the EU. In fact, things continuously went on an upward trajectory. So very different models. So anything, if you have time, if you could throw light on these two.
Here's a question.
I have two questions. I'll make it quick. So the first one I wanted to ask was, you said something about populism as kind of gaming the system in a way. Now, the way I was thinking of gaming the system was in terms of perhaps controlling a media narrative, in terms of sort of fudging numbers and so on and so forth. I was wondering whether there was more to this business of gaming the system, if at all, that you might want to shed light on. The other one was a comment that you made, which, well, it says family is the ideological function of the state. I might also, sort of want to think of this in terms of family as the ideological function of the economy in the kind of original sense with an O in the Aristotelian sense, which was the new organization of the household, and use that as a conduit to talk about taxes vis-a-vis corruption, because where one is talking about corruption, one might also then think about taxes as, for one, sort of supporting, singular sort of tax right at the end. But then when you get to interstate level, taxes, there are various taxes that each state sort of levies on the circulation of commodities and the sale and so on and so forth. This is just some straight thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm doing a PhD on GST, the Department of Transport, so that's what I'm.
I can take this question. Yeah, we have 1 minute. Give it a little bit of time. So
Maybe 2-3 minutes.
So no, just I'll try to what Anuruddh was saying. I think if I have to rephrase of using a terminology where it's a recapture of the voids socioculturally that were left behind, right? Based on what was happening. Let's say those voids which were very clear under, if you're looking at the Indian context, UK to Brazil's case, what's happening post Lula and then before Bolsonaro is coming, there's a certain kind of disconnect, which is well established. And I think one way of looking at it is what's happening with the intellectual elite network that is commanding a lot of influence in policy-making circles. In India, for example, we know it very clearly. You know, the Delhi sort of consensus was you have a bunch of people educated in certain institutions, Ivy League, and having a major influence in policy in India. And at the same time, there is a disconnect of that community of scholars with what's happening at the grassroots level. And David Roderick and many others were writing about this in terms of their work, this contents. The notion of bringing populism into the discourse as a conscious choice was who is at the center of driving that change? Is it a person? Is it a personality? Is it an individual leader? And then the conversation pivoted towards, yes, in each of the countries' cases, if it was not, for example, for Modi or Erdogan or Putin for that matter, or Bolsonaro, the nature of change, which was so seismic, would have been difficult to be underpinned. There is a cult of personality. There's a focus on one leader and one leader's rise to power as being seen as the anti-whatever, you can say the alternative point of force. And the third key factor is that there is a conscious measure by each of these leaders to mobilize masses, right? And the majority towards, and those are the underpinning forces of what populist movement would be looking at. So that's where the use of the word political economy of populism is important. The other point, which is looking at what's happening, and we can take a couple of questions which will require a longer response post, once we've taken a break, is the fact that you might not find that a lot of the conversation around each of these leaders is also pivoting as a distinct factor of what's happening now versus what's happening that's in the 70s and Indira Gandhi and others, is that there is a way, as Ambreen was pointing on, how women are perceived, for example, in the society. The reason for each of the strongmen having taken a position of women in the society and the perspective of being seen as mothers or taking care of care providers, it's very sort of unanimous. On Bolsonaro was criticized, and one of the biggest factors of him sort of losing the popular votes is the fact of his comments of women. Trump, very similarly, I think. Modi's case, not too different on that matter, of seeing women as mothers, not the agency of women largely being part of the center of driving social mobility and change. Beyond that, or as care providers or caregivers. I think that's the other factor which is bringing that.
Is that true, Modi also?
Yes. You read Modi's. A lot of interestingly, when you're looking at Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay, who we were speaking to, has written the biography. Initially, when you're talking about how he would perceive the role of women, it was very aligned to the RSS terminology, which is to see women's role largely being as a nursing care provider, service provider, and making sure that everything leading up to a certain stage in his or her life, largely women should lead up to becoming a good mother, like as part of the. And Modi's statements were largely would root back to his own mother and how, for example, his understanding of role of women in society was related to that. Much of what was said by Bolsonaro as a critical voice in the popular domain or by Putin is consistent. Erdogan's views are also in that case consistent. Now, there are these similar notions which are affecting each one's disposition while being in power. Is it centered to the analysis we are trying to frame in the book? Not really. What we are trying to understand is whether once a particular leader is coming into power, are there certain forces they're using as tools to sustain that control and centralizing of power? And to that, you see that the role of religion, for example, or ideologically using religion as a force to centralize and control popular movements is very central to their goal and objective. Final point on the role of whether you have a populism which is driven from a caste or a class or a gender-based. I think these social aggregates are very, very much dependent on which country and in which period of time you're sort of identifying. if you were to look at a Turkey of the 1990s, the nature of economic factors that were in the play, the crises that Turkey was experiencing, time again, high inflation, lot of issues on the banking front. That time, Erdogan's priorities were seen as part of the economic reformer. Like 2000s, the game and the role very much changes. Now with Modi also, you've seen that 2014, it was a very different sort of a campaign. 2019, it was a very different campaign. Then national security takes months. I think the two most understudied emphasis that I would acknowledge is role of social media. Point, I mean, we mentioned that how media was used as a factor to sort of bring the focus on many discourses. And the second is the role of national security based discourse to each of these leaders' ability to, whenever they were losing grip of, let's say, a popular vote, suddenly you will find a national security clause being very important. Yeah. So I think that's something which you will find that national security is a very important word as well. We've not looked at that, but that's something which one may want to expand on beyond this. We'll stop there. Always a lot to talk, but
That question will be after the.
yes.
I think we are well out of time. We have actually 10 minutes over. Thank you,
Deepanshu
and Abhinav, for joining us today to discuss your book. Thank you, Ambreen and Siddharth, for offering your comments, and thank you for participating. Thank you to the online audience also for asking those interesting questions. I hope we will address most of them, but as I started by saying that this is the kind of concept on which you can have discussion for years. We'll never come to an agreement because there's so much to talk about. But I hope we all learned something, more nuanced understanding of this idea and how it applies to different contexts. Thank you.